son, where'd you find this?
Buckle up, buttercups. It's time to get down to business. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Totally legit.
All right, folks, here we are again. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Today, we have a very exciting guest. We have Aryn Youngless of Genealogy by Aryn on all of the socials. We're super excited to talk to you today, and welcome to the show.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
So I guess let's first just start off by giving my listeners a quick overview of what you do, and then we can kind of get into what inspired the genealogy bug.
Okay. Well, I research family history and genealogy. So basically what I do is I help people build out their family trees, learn about ancestors they don't know about, or learn more about ancestors they do know about, to help, well, some people just want to know. I find that it can be very therapeutic, learning where you come from.
Sure. And so is this something that you are always kind of interested in, spent a long time going to school? Or is this something like later in life with the advent of newer technologies, you're like, this excites me, I'm going to pivot to this?
COVID is what the pivot was.
Yeah, it did it for a lot of things.
Yeah, you can't do all of genealogy from home, but you can do a good part of it. There's accessibility nowadays. Like you said, the internet has changed so many things. And when COVID happened, I was teaching yoga and doing things like that. And I have been working on my family history for a long time. I grew up in a 3-generational home. So my grandmother lived with us. And so I don't know, I was interested in my family history, but my family is very recent in the overall scheme of things, where my husband's family has been here since like before the country was a country. So working on his was also interesting too. And then when COVID hit, it was like, I don't want to be an online yoga teacher. That's not interests me at all.
Yeah, sure.
And I was, I'm like, well, why don't I just do this?
That's amazing. So like what are like the pathways to learning this subject? Because I know like in the past 20 years, there's been a ton of new developments and access to types of technology. But like, how do you go about becoming learned on these things?
I read a lot. I've always been a huge reader. And also, to be very honest, I grew up in a house that was very history heavy.
Sure.
It's like one of my very first jobs was a historical interpreter at a living museum.
Wow.
So, yeah. So like, I've always been a big history nerd. My dad's a big history nerd. My whole family is. And talking about family and that has always interested me. And I've always loved libraries. Libraries are a huge access point for anybody. Most libraries have a genealogy and history section, and most libraries, larger libraries, have a genealogy historian or a librarian who can come in and help you with that. So I would say, jumping online is great, but I would say go to your local library, especially if you're from that area. So when you move, it can be a little difficult. Using the internet, sites like Family Search, which are free, are very helpful, I find.
Do you think, so you were saying before how like some people are just interested. I think most people are interested just generally where they come from, but do you think this is kind of like opened the door for younger people to get involved in this? Like, cause I feel like how a family tree used to be passed down was literally by your family. Somebody was keeping tabs, and hopefully nothing got erased or, written incorrectly. But, do you think just like the ease of this technology and the access of this technology is making people who were not interested before and did not care at all suddenly be like, I want to know all the details?
I think it provides access where in the past maybe you were interested, but starting is difficult. Hiring a genealogist, and I want everybody to hire me, but it's expensive.
Yeah.
It may not be accessible. I do find that there are a lot of younger people. A lot of times genealogy and family history is associated with older generations. You know, you're aging, and then now suddenly you wish you would have asked your grandparents questions, but they died 30 years ago. But there are younger generations that want to know about where they came from. And I think a lot of it has to do with generational healing and understanding that maybe you feel a certain way because of genetics, and your great aunt was also, you know, super artistic, where the rest of your family wasn't. And I see a lot of that. I see a lot of things being handed down. So when I talk to people that they are just trying to find their place in the world, and maybe it's not accessible on this generational level, so looking backwards helps present possibly people who acted like you or had interests like you or lived lifestyles like you, therefore making you feel more inclusive into the overall community of the world.
Sure. Yeah, and you were also saying too, and I'm sure you found this a lot, but like how when you start doing this for people on a scale of 1 to 10, how often are people like amazed by how different what the truth of their genealogy is as compared to what they were told it was? Yeah, or what what one group of the family said.
That's a 10. Yeah. Especially with the onset of ancestry DNA and genealogy DNA.
Right.
Yeah. All those little skeletons in the closet, the closet's being blown open. Where with paper, you can lie.
Yeah, sure.
And I've had issues with that where I've been working with a client and their DNA is saying one thing, and then the paper trail saying something completely different because, grandma had an affair. And suddenly that's why your one aunt doesn't look like the rest of the family. But on paper, her dad's your dad.
Yeah, right.
But when you look at the DNA, it changes a lot of things.
So most of do you do people from all over the world, or mostly people from a specific area of the world, like states or? Yeah,
United States. I do a lot in the Midwest because I grew up in that area, so I know it very, very well. I love LA, so and I have accessibility. Los Angeles has incredible depositories and libraries that have so much access to things. Yeah. And it's also access to information that would be elsewhere. So with Family Search, if you go on through their catalog, every now and then you'll find something that'll have a little lock and key on it, and they want you to go to their library specifically, but you may not live near one of the Family Search libraries. But if you go to an affiliate library, like I can go to the Los Angeles Public Library and I can look through all of that once I'm on their system. Yeah, so it's still free. If you're researching your family history and you're in the United States and you jump the pond and suddenly you're in England or Germany or on the other side, Japan, Asia, find a genealogist in that area.
Sure.
Yeah. It's better to have boots on the ground.
That does make sense. And like you were saying too, it makes it more difficult to research these things if you've moved because you're not in the repository. Especially like a smaller location, the further you get away, the less likely you're going to get your hands on that actual information. So I guess let's start this off by, I want to hear some wild stories, and I'm sure there are many wild stories. And in particular with America, I always laugh because I'll agree with you. My experience has been the same. Any person that I know that has done any type of ancestral research has been shocked by what they found. And again, we have the internet and access to information the way that we have it now to thank for that. But what are some crazy things that you came across in your own family that you're like, wow, I was not expecting that?
So one of my family branches nobody knows a lot about because there was a huge family argument and people stopped talking to people. So when I started doing my ancestry, I wanted to know a lot about that area because I knew nothing about them. And This is my dad's mom's side of the family. And to get a better idea of the story, when my family grew up, my parents were from Cleveland and they moved to like a little town next door called Lakewood, which is important to the story. The area that we lived in was very Slavic, Polish, Slovenian, Czechoslovakian, So, and we were, everybody spoke some sort of dialect and English. You need to know that because as about 3 years ago, I finally had a break in my family tree. And I found out that one of my great uncles lived 2 blocks from my house. And we had never met them. We didn't know. And one of the women at my church, because I grew up in the Catholic Church, and my mom's, her best friend was my cousin. Had no idea.
Crazy.
Yeah, and then the more I dug into it, I found out that I had a huge chunk of family that lived within walking distance of my house. And it was really funny because when I was little, I would remember these Slovenian Polish women looking at my dad, and then they'd stop talking. They'd whisper something, and then they'd stop talking, and we'd be like, what was that? And I'm like, now I wonder if he just looked like the family.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, it's him. Don't say anything. But yeah, that was one of the craziest ones in my family.
That is absolutely nuts. You're living that close to that many relatives.
Yes. Had no idea. I know for a fact I walked past their house because I used to hang out in that area, but had no idea.
Yeah, this is something I struggle with all the time. Like we're getting more and more connected, and in a time where it feels like there's more division. We're trying to create more division with each other. There's like a lot of things. We're much more tightly connected than we would like to think.
Yes.
And that's why I feel like what you do is important because it reveals that to people. I can't tell you how many times I grew up in the South, but most of my family's from the Northeast. I'm in the Northeast now. And, we would ask people like, oh, where'd you come from? Where's your family from? And they'd be like, oh, we're from here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I know that, but like, how did they get here? Like, they weren't here before everybody else was here. They didn't discover this. So like, where'd they come from? And it's just, I don't know what it is that makes me feel this way, but I feel like this is the kind of information that makes people start to think more globally. We start to think less about borders, and we start to think less about towns and cities, and think more about like we're all just people roaming on this, living organism here. I don't know. Again, that's why I always see this, looking into this type of stuff is important, is because it reveals how much more connected to the world than you might think you are right now.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of fun stories that I've learned, but one of the biggest things that I have learned, and I've said this and I get pushback from people, but genealogy is a community because humans are a community. And the best way to learn your genealogy is to do it as a community and to talk to other people and try to see where they came from. I've learned stuff about history that I never learned in textbooks because it's not the important history. Especially if you're not going to go off to college and get a degree in history, your historical knowledge is probably going to be very limited to what you're seeing in high school or maybe your bachelor's or associates. But there's so much more out there that connects us and so many different experiences that we've all had. And when we don't talk about it, it's true. If you don't learn from history, it repeats itself. It just does. And by educating yourself, maybe you think history is boring because it was presented boring in high school or college. Because it is. It's the same boring facts, and you need to learn these dates, and this is when Sherman did this, and this is what, But there's a lot more that goes into it, and when you start learning about history from this microscopic level of individual humans, it changes things, and it shows you how much more we have in common. Like coming across to Ellis Island. And when people go on to websites like Ancestry, and they'll find one page, and they'll say, this line, that's my great-grandfather. But the whole thing is 234 pages. That's one ship. That's not 234 ships. That's one ship. Those are all the people that were on that ship. And if you're in those really scriggly pages at the end, that means you were in steerage. So you were in underneath the deck for this really long trip with all of these people. And we all have that in common. You stood in line like cattle at Ellis Island so that you could check your name off a list. And we all have that in common. We all struggled. We all had to find new jobs. And I think it just, I don't know, for me, it shows this community because I know some of those people became friends and some of those people never saw their relatives ever again. And there's just a bigger story that I think we miss when we don't dive in deeper.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, especially with Americans getting so hilariously short-sighted with the fact that what makes this country great is the diversity, is the fact that we let all those people in and let them build their own world here. That's why we have the things that we have here. Again, I feel like we're really short-sighted. But again, you're doing the service by making people aware that this is stuff that they can look into and kind of just telling the story, helping people tell their own story of humanity.
Yes.
You know. So I guess we can open this up a little more. So you found some pretty wild things in your own tree, but like, what are some of the crazier things that you've come across in researching other folks out there? And do you is this something that you're always doing strictly for hire, or are there sometimes where you're like, you know what, I'm into this person, let me trace their tree?
Oh, I do that. There's rabbit holes that you just go down.
Yeah, for
and
sure. I figured as much. But.
Yeah. One tree that I worked on, I found out this family came to the U.S. from, where were they from? They were from England. And they went from England to Liverpool, and they took a ship from Liverpool going up around Ireland with the intent of then crossing the Atlantic. And they got to the top of Ireland, and there's a ton of keys, tiny little jagged rocks, and there was a storm. And the ship hit the rocks, and it crashed. And in the newspaper, it said the savage locals of Ireland came onto the ship and took everybody's everything. And as the time went out, no, there was mutiny. The people working on the ship stole the passenger stuff and left them in the middle of this, in these keys, and they had to get off. So they literally had to get off the ship, walk back to Liverpool, make their way back to Liverpool, get on a second ship, and then come to the United States. Yes. And then the ship captain was never charged. It was just like, oh, don't do that again, which you see all the time. All the time. It's crazy.
Just as like, they're immigrating, he took their money, whatever.
Yeah, took their money, took their trunks, took whatever they thought was valuable, and then just left them there in the middle of nowhere in a boat that was sinking. Yeah, yeah. But the story goes on. So the family clearly wanted to sue England, and a trial started. And then many, many years later, one of the people in the family, he was 10 years old at the time. As an adult, I think he was 33. He got wind that there was going to be a trial, so they were going to get compensation for going through this horrific thing. So he gets on a boat and he travels back to England. But on the way back, he got tuberculosis. So he writes his wife this note that he's feeling slightly under the weather, but he's on his way to London and he is going to get the money. And he died in his hometown where he was born because he got sick, and then nothing was ever done. No one ever was compensated. Nothing ever went to Parliament. Yes. Yes. So, yeah, it was tragic and kind of crazy.
Damn, that's one of those ones where you're like, man, I wish I had known that history. You tell me I could be a billionaire now, working on some, 1800s gold. What? That's wild though. So like you're actually sourcing this. You're like going through the timelines of local records and just finding as the story emerges over decades. Yes.
And well, then I was even more fortunate because in that family line, I was able to talk to another relative. And in every family, if somebody's in the family history, there's that one person and they have boxes. And he had boxes. He actually had a physical letter from the husband to the wife saying, I will be home soon tell my daughter I love her, and then he passed away. But he had all these wonderful documents that he shared with me, so I was able to see firsthand these the handwriting and what was going on, and that whole family was really interesting. Then the daughter, she worked at an insane asylum as like an intake person for a little while. Jeez. And yeah, they're very interesting. Yeah.
That is wild. That is, well, pioneers, rugged pioneers.
Well, that was
who survived being, abandoned at sea.
True. But that was, I want to say early 1900s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not pioneer time, just pioneer in the metaphoric sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was that huge migration period from the late 1800s through like the 1920s, 30s, where so many people just moved to the United States. At one point, Ireland had more Irish people than Ireland did. Or Boston had more Irish people than Ireland did. Because Ireland just kept sending everybody to Boston, and Boston was finally like, okay, you guys have to pick a different port. Yeah, and New York with Italy, there's so many Italians in that area because they would just go and I found relatives of mine, they would be there for 1 year, and then they'd move over to Cleveland in that area.
Right. Yeah, this was like the required stopping point.
Yes.
Yeah, that always trips me out too. I live in New York, so I love history and history that I can touch. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of that in New York, and I just love walking around this place and thinking, at one time the Italians ran this whole city.
Yeah,
it's just very wild to think that how the landscape has changed from decade to decade in a place like this. Or Boston, same thing. Like you walk around Boston, there's hundreds of years of history. Those streets have seen so many different things.
Yeah.
But I guess the next question would be like, are there any people that a lot of people would know, historical folks, celebrities, who you've gone down the rabbit hole and you've discovered some like
connection to?
Yeah, connections to maybe history that wasn't known, or a deeper understanding of a particular period in their life.
Trying to think. Define celebrity.
It doesn't have to be like movie star celebrity, but just a name from history. They could be a politician, any person, any individual person from the historical context of America that you've looked into.
Bessie Coleman. I did something on very recently. Are you familiar with her? Okay, so Bessie Coleman grew up in Texas. Her dad was African American and either Cherokee or Choctaw, and her mom was African American. And in 1901, her dad... Oh, thank you. Her dad moved back to Oklahoma because there was mass lynchings happening in Texas. And her mom was like, well, your dad and I can't read, but you will. You will all find education and you will educate yourself. And she went to school early. I think she was like 4 or 5 years old and she started going to school. And she could read and write and everything. And even when she was little, she would read to her younger siblings. And she got her hands on Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was by far one of her least favorite books on the planet because she felt that it was a misrepresentation of the enslaved population. So she decided that she was just going to keep educating herself, went to college for, I think, a semester, but couldn't afford it, moved to Chicago, became a manicurist, started hearing about these pilots from World War I. And she was like, this is amazing, I want to fly. And her father was a sharecropper, so she was familiar with flying. And she went out of her way to become a pilot. And no one in the United States would take her because she was female and a woman of color. So she got into a school in France. And she was the very first American, female, and Native American, African American to ever get an international pilot's license ever.
Wow.
Yes.
That's so cool.
And she was just incredible. She even came back to the U.S. and she would use her... At the time, if you were a civilian pilot, your job, the only job you could get was to be a stunt pilot.
Yeah,
so do
sure.
air shows, yeah. So she would go around and do different air shows, and when people started noticing her and thinking that we have to go see this woman, she would say, well, I will only perform there if you, everybody can come in through the same door, if it's not segregated, if blacks and white can sit together. And a lot of places allowed her to do that.
Wow.
Yeah, including Texas.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, especially during those eras, when we hear the history of any of the musical artists or celebrities, anybody that dealt with any of those areas of the country during that time, it was just always so funny how they'd be racist up to a certain point. But once like they could make enough money off of it, then they're like, okay, well, we won't be racist for this one thing because we're going to make a lot of money off of it. The pre-Civil War or Civil Rights era down there is just, that's very strange history. That is kind of my other question, because I was born in Mississippi. I lived in Florida. I lived in Tennessee. Spent a lot of time in the South, and I'm wondering if you have any strange stories that tied like a family back to the South in the dark times.
Not anything that's coming off the top of my head. That area is interesting to research because it's hard to research.
Oh, sure.
Things go missing. War is a huge issue. Weather,
Yep.
Katrina killed a lot. Like, a lot of things were destroyed. I don't know. I have lots of personal feelings about that area.
Yeah.
So when I look at information, okay, so here's some interesting facts. Years ago, I was researching a friend's family, and they ended up in Ohio. They started in England, Ireland, and then to Ohio. And this part of the family lived in a town called Darke County, and it's spelled Darke, and everyone says Drake, but it's Darke. And the reason Darke County was so interesting is because after the emancipation, a lot of people moved to this area. Ohio, during the Civil War, they were the Hail Mary of the Civil War for the North. The governor was like, we need to do this. And so when everybody had stopped enlisting, because the Civil War had been going on for a while, people from Ohio was still going.
Wow.
And in Darke County, it was very triracial. So there were Native Americans, there were freed slaves, and there were white people, and they were all together. It wasn't like one lived here, one lived there, and one lived there. They all lived together.
Completely commingled. Yeah.
Completely commingling, completely marrying each other. There was still a black versus white cemetery, but I found like an Irish woman who was born in Dublin. She's buried in the black cemetery because her husband was, and her family was. And then you also have a lot of like the Amish type people that are in the area, and the Quakers did not. In a time period when other parts of our country would send somebody who has special needs to a sanatorium, they didn't. So on top of having Native American, African American, white, European, you also have people in that area who were handicapped and crippled, and they were still part of the community, and they were still going to church together. And I think that's just so interesting and sad, because it's not like that at all anymore. In doing research in that area, when it was
definitely not.
Yeah, so that was but there's a lot of that when you look in the Ohio region, because it was this battlefield state, quite literally, that the people in there were, everybody talks about the big Gettysburg battles and that, but there were these in-between battles that a lot of the OVIs, the Ohio Volunteer Infantries, were going in and running interference that no one ever talks about. So these people were going in and like disrupting supply chains from the South, and taking Confederates to the North and being like, oh, isn't it better here? And some of them being like, oh God, it is. And like documented proof of them being like, oh yay, thank God I'm here now. And so that's been really interesting. And then the revisionist history that I will see when you don't look further into those documents
Yeah, well, I mean, the revisionists, you bring up a lot of really good points, in particular, just in relation to the record keeping in the South just wasn't that great, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And then, of course, like things like Katrina, things like Atlanta being burned to the ground, but a lot of this stuff isn't impossible to find. It's just hard.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily that it's deliberately been omitted. It's just it didn't make it into our crappy textbooks of history in school. New York fascinates me because I'll do the same thing. I'll look into an area and just try and go back in time and see what was going on in that area as opposed to what's going on there now. Mm-hmm. And, even Central Park, there was like a thriving black community.
Yeah.
A thriving black town. And the developers of New York City were like, no, we can't have that. Let's just demolish it, push them further out, and build a park here. There's so many different little instances like that.
Well, then during the Depression, Central Park became a Hoover town.
Yeah, right. Shanty town, right, exactly. Yeah. There was maybe a quarter of a page about Hoover towns, shanty towns, in maybe the chapter on Great Depression. That was it.
Right. Actually, in that vein, something else cool that I've learned. So, a lot of genealogists, actually historians, and maybe you're into it too, I don't know, but I go to cemeteries a lot. And I love it, especially out here in LA. It's just bananas.
Oh, sure. That's got to be nuts. You see everyone's grave. Yeah.
Exactly. You turn the corner and like, oh my God, that's Walt Disney. All right. I had no idea. Or Michael Landon, where people come and leave him messages because he was in Touched by an Angel, and so they assume there's something. I don't know. But I found this one grave, and it was this guy's face, and he was like, and it said, I was in the pictures. And so I looked him up, and he lived maybe a mile from where I lived when he lived here back in the day. But he was from the central United States. His family got hit by the Depression and the Dust Bowl really bad. And they moved west. When that whole migration moved from the middle United States to the west, people had cars. But before the Depression hit, because people had cars, all these different car parks start showing up. So you could go camping, car camping parks.
Yeah.
And when the Depression hit, all they had left were their cars. So these fun little vacation spots actually became homes. And so I found him and his mom and his siblings living in a car park in a part of LA that's just like streets now. You would never know there was even room to have a car park there. But he went from nothing, losing everything, I think he was maybe 10, to coming out here and then working with some of the famous people back in the day, Charlie Chaplin, all of that, and having a house and everything, and then being buried in this beautiful mausoleum in LA. And it's the true epitome of what people think is the American dream.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and it was like but it was just funny. It's like, I worked in pictures.
I worked in the pictures.
Like, you sure did, buddy. But yeah, and I love things like that. But I never heard about. I had no idea that was a thing, that people were living in their cars at that time period. And I had no idea. The first time I had ever heard of a shanty town was because of Doctor Who in 2006. I watched an episode, but I'd never heard about it. We never talked about that. We talk about, I don't know, Gettysburg and the Revolutionary War. And then when we talk about those things, we're not even talking about a lot of it. Or the Gold Rush, fun Gold Rush fact. When the Gold Rush happened in the United States, in France, they had been, Revolution, Napoleon, Revolution. And during the second round, a bunch of young French guys were part of the revolution, and then it ended, but they still wanted to beat people up. And the government's like, there's a gold rush going on in the United States. If you want to go there, we'll send you there. So they sent all of these rowdy French people to the west coast of the United States just so they could get them out of France. And it worked. So then you could see like that demographic, the northern, as you move up into Canada, and everyone just assumes it's because the French came down, but it's not. It's because they sent them here and they went up.
Wow, that is hilarious. Did that have any? I'm just totally grasping at straws here. Did that have anything to do with Napa Valley? Like Napa Valley being like a wine capital of the world?
I don't know. I don't actually know a lot about Napa Valley area, but now I'll have to look it up.
That is so funny, though. I can just see the French doing that.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we got a place for you.
You're gonna find
love
gold. It's gonna be great. Yeah. No.
That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like there's two. This is just like a funny thing I've noticed in my life. There's like two things that you always learn more over time, and it's just as people get older, they're more willing to talk about it. And it's like stuff that happened during wars and stuff that happened in some kind of migratory process, whether it was coming over from Europe or the migration of blacks out of the South up into the Midwest, places like Chicago and St. Louis, because I feel like those are areas where secrets were necessary. And I'm wondering if, like, of any other stories in particular relating to wartime intelligence or some kind of thing that had to have been kept secret, but then as people got older and through your research, you're able to kind of piece together.
Trying to think of, so wartime stuff can be difficult. In 1973, if World War II, part of World War I, and part of Korea, there was a huge fire in St. Louis, and it took out a huge section of their personnel records.
Wow.
Right. So you could still do it. I mean, a lot of times people were stationed overseas, so it burned in the United States, but it didn't burn in England.
Right.
So they're going to have records there. From a personal level, no. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of things that you wouldn't think are still classified that are still classified. Vietnam is still very, very, very classified. So you can be like, my one friend, I was helping her learn stuff about her dad, and we could find that he was a mechanic, but they wouldn't tell you where he was a mechanic, because if they told you where he was a mechanic, you could put two and two together. My great uncle joined the military, post World War I, so the 20s, when no one else wanted to be in the military because World War I ended and then the influenza outbreak happened.
Yeah.
And the propaganda at the time was like, well, this is because of the war. And then the Depression. But he was in for a long time, and he landed in Normandy and he left through Nuremberg. So he was in all of it.
In the shit, yeah.
Yeah. And we don't have a lot of information because we had, there was one relative and they were going to be the keeper of it. And then they died and their kids threw everything out. Yeah. But I wrote the National Archives and they're like, nope. I'm like,
yeah.
Please? They're like, well, here's his discharge papers. I'm like, but I know when he was discharged, but they still won't. There's not a lot of information out there. I do need to circle back on that. There could be another way that I could go in. But yeah, it's interesting from a personal perspective. I'm just trying to think. Well, it's funny because I don't have a lot. My dad was in the Coast Guard during the Vietnam era, so he was stateside. And my great uncle was World War II. My grandfather enlisted but was honorably discharged because he was blind in one eye, and he memorized the eye chart because he really wanted to. Yes. So
beat the system.
He did. So he made it all the way out here to San Pedro and was stationed out here, and they were like, wait a minute, and he was like, damn. So he went back home. So on that level, and then like my husband's grandfather, he was in Germany, and I know that he was part of an artillery unit, but he refused to talk about it. He would only ever tell one story that they were, it was nighttime and they were camped and they heard this noise, and it obviously had to be the Germans, and they weren't answering, so it obviously had to be because they weren't speaking the right language, so they attacked and they killed this cow, and it was a cow, and it wasn't the Germans at all.
Moo.
Yeah. But besides like those small stories, I don't have a lot. I do have read, other stories about World War II and like spy stuff in the United States, and there are a lot of things going on I don't think we ever talk about. Well, I never heard about, like in Harlem, the Japanese targeted Harlem to try to get them to back the Imperials to help disrupt the United States.
So like an intelligence propaganda campaign. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Holy shit.
Yeah, and there was just like sections of people in Harlem that were recruiting to support, and it was happening in Germany. Also, there are, if you look at old newspapers, there are full-on Nazi gatherings with giant banners in New York.
Well, I'm actually working on like a whole string of content, but yeah, that's the 1939 Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. You can look that up, easily accessible by anybody. That was run by this organization called the Bund, and the Bund actually sponsored Nazi summer camps all over the country. There were 3 in the New York, New Jersey area: Camp Nordland, Camp Siegfried, and Camp Sunderland, or I don't know, some other German name. But there was a lot more counterintelligence going on in America during that time than I think anybody. I am somebody who is pretty aware. I read a lot into that history, and there is some stuff that I've discovered in the past couple weeks and months of speaking with people and reading books that were just like, I cannot believe even somebody who has spent a long time looking for this information, I'm only finding it now. It took me 20 years to get to the point where I could figure out where this was and read it. And it's there. And it's all like, it's very, very serious. It's funny that you say that, because I feel like most people, when I ask them that question, they all have a similar conversation. I have a family member who is enlisted in this branch or that branch, and they did some things, and we were trying to get some information after they died, and we just got stonewalled. Even my mom's uncle was telling her about the stuff I was putting together about New York, and she's like, "Oh, your uncle worked for Bell Labs, and he did some stuff in the Kwajalein Islands." And the Kwajalein Islands are like I don't know if you know what that is, but it's like a very classified military settlement in the South Pacific, and Bell Labs too. Bell Labs would have been big stuff. And she's sending like pictures of the wards that he'd get from work, and it was like Department of Psychological Warfare in the Army. It's like, that's crazy. It's crazy, and it's like he's died. I had a great time with him when I was a kid. When I would go over there, he used to just for fun like take things all the way apart and put them back to cars, whatever, any like complex machinery. He'd just take it all the way apart and put it back together. So I always had a blast with him, but if my mom had never said that, I never would have known. Yeah. I never would have known that he had this whole area of his history that is stuff that I'm super interested in, but he of course couldn't talk about even if he was alive still today, because most of it's still classified. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of, American history is especially pertaining to World War II that we don't talk about and we don't know, or if we do, it's in a way that it's like, well, out here there was a Nazi enclave in the mountains, and now everybody goes to it because it's graffitied, and I'll hear people talk about it, but that's it. Did you know the Nazis were in the mountains? And then that it's like, well, if they were in the mountains, that means a lot more. That means that they were around, and there's the co-mingling with us. Yeah. Exactly. And talking to people and trying to get, people to come to their side. And a lot of times with World War II, everybody goes, "Oh, Hawaii." But I mean, there were U-boats off of New York. There were Long U-boats, Island, Boston. Mm-hmm, Sacramento. Yep. There was a U-boat that shot a shipyard in Sacramento. Up north. Oh, it actually fired at it? Damn. It fired, yeah. And then 2 days later, I think, was when the air raid of Los Angeles happened, or the Battle of Los Angeles. My gosh. So, and that's on my to-do list.
I actually just finished. Have you read Operation Underworld yet?
What is that?
Oh my God.
I haven't even heard of that. I'm writing it down right now.
All right, you have to. Operation Underworld is World War II when the Navy enlisted help from the mob.
The mob. Oh, yeah. Love this already.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
I'm all for that.
They worked with like Lucky Luciano. It's a thing.
Of course.
And it was effective, you know? And we don't talk about that because we can't be those people, but it was effective. Like you said, New York was very Italian, and that area right on the waterfront was very first generation or not even Italian. So who's the better people to talk to?
They ran the docks. They ran the docks. They ran the docks. You had to deal with them. Yeah.
So like that was what I just finished, and now I'm moving on to I want to learn more about the West Coast region, because we do out here by the Queen Mary. There's I think it's a Russian submarine that they captured off the coast.
Wow. Yeah.
During the Cold War.
Cold War. Yeah, that would make sense. There's a lot of that's another like whole strange thing to go down to is the Cold War and the sub activity, because it's just there's a lot and it is documented. It's just very, very hard to sift through all the nonsense to get to it.
Yes, it's there, but they don't make it easily accessible.
For sure, and for good reason. The one thing, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this too. The one thing that has always tripped me out is post-war the heavy monitoring that our government did, as well as the collection that our government did of Nazi scientists, right? Operation Paperclip. There's a couple other bigger operations that were conducted to round up all the top tier scientists and get them doing their research for us. It's how we got to the moon. Wernher von Braun was in charge of NASA. Him and 130 people account for like the rocket portion, but we took 1,600 of them. And it is now known, because of declassified documents, that we were monitoring another large settlement of them in South America. And that is I don't know if you've come across that history at all, but like there's this town in South America. I'll pull it up. It's called Bariloche. It's literally a Bavarian village in the middle of the jungle. Colonia Dignidad is what it was called. This is crazy. And when you go there, you can actually meet, like, there's people who are descendants of top-ranking Nazis. And this because a lot of these South American countries were fascist. They were Nazi-leaning, but like well before America even enters the war. These Argentina, there's this one's the worst, but then there's another couple different settlements all throughout South America, and they even pulled a couple. Mossad got a couple of the Nazis. Albert Eichmann, there's a couple like big names in there that you're like, oh damn, he was just working at a Mercedes plant in Peru or something. But I'm the reason I'm bringing it up is because in the past years, as a lot of this stuff has gotten declassified, there's been people who have gone down and like they've met actual descendants of these Nazis, like the people they snuck out of Germany and were living in the jungle and kind of escaped it. I'm wondering if at any point through any of your sifting through any history, if you've come into anybody's past that might have been connected to that. Because I like not necessarily Nazis, but maybe like a family that wasn't totally unsympathetic to Nazis. Because the more I have looked into that over the course of the past 2 months, the more I have found like not people who were pro Germany. They were Nazis and they were in America, and you wouldn't have known. They were just in an American neighborhood doing an American thing, but they 100% were Nazis.
Well, my neighborhood growing up, there was a man named John Demaniuk. I'm saying his wrong name incorrectly, I'm sure, but he was he worked at Auschwitz. He was
oh, jeez.
Yes, and that was, I remember growing up, and that was on the news all the time. But out here and through genealogy, I have I've met people who have connections, and it was always conversations at home, like, oh, no. When they would ask their parents, no. We would not do that.
We were the good ones.
Yeah, and then be like, well, this person only spoke German. And this person, when we would go there, they were kids, but when they would go there at night, we get sent to their rooms, their grandparents and aunts and uncles would have meetings. And everything would be in German. And Hitler's picture was in the basement. And yeah. Like history, especially with textbook history, is very much written in a very patriotic way. So, but a lot of that was here. You can see it. You can feel it. This is what that looks like now. Are these people who they were always here? This hasn't changed. It's just it's just louder at the moment, and hopefully not for long. But
well, but see, that's why I think these are important things to talk about, because I hear so many people in my generation, at least, they're like, "How did we get here?" And it's like, guys, we've been here. This is what we are. If we look into the history, we'll find that this stuff was never that far away. It was like apt pupil right across the street from us. And like you're saying, now it's become acceptable for that to be more out in the open again.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Like the internet is a fantastic resource, and social media is, I think it's great. I do. But the problem is that there are no limits. So people can go on and say whatever they want, and we're seeing this generation of people who don't want to fact check. They just want to feel, and feelings are fantastic. And I really think everybody should meditate and be in touch with their feelings, and we should have good mental health, which is also an issue in this country and elsewhere, I'm sure. But the facts still are important. And when I here's a pet peeve of mine, and I was watching some of your podcasts, so I know this came up before.
Right.
But The Greatest Generation is the name of a Tom Brokaw book, and then in the nightly news he announced it, and everybody went, oh, emotions. And then they started calling the GI generation the Greatest Generation. They're called the GI generation because people who were born in the late 1800s, early 1900s had nothing but war their entire life. And we're forgetting because we don't talk about it. Everybody talks about World War II because it's romantic and it's so romanticized. And things that need to be understood is that during early World War II, when we were just in it in like 41, we were sending ships to the east to go to England to give them supplies, and like 50 plus tankers were being sank every month. And well, we didn't talk about it because it's not that big of a deal because there weren't troops on board. There were people on board and they died. But let's romanticize it, and it was honestly just food, so let's not freak out. But World War I was horrible. It was horrible. It was a trench war. It was chemical war. I've seen records with people who had trench mouth. That means that their face rotted out because they were in water too long. Yes. And then they come back, and then now, oh great, we're home and we have to get back to work. And so you start seeing these records in steel mills. And then the flu pandemic hits. And these people they're dying because there's no way to treat them. And then World War, now we get through that and we have the stock market crash. So now we're poor and we have nothing to eat. And then there's the Dust Bowl. And well, World War II starting, everybody knew about it. 36. Everybody knew.
It was a long time coming.
It was a long time coming, and we weren't part of it. So then I hear, and don't get me wrong, I think people who volunteered and went to World War II, I think they did amazing things.
Sure.
But so they did in the First World War as well, and there's a lot of people who have done a lot of amazing things that don't fall into that time frame of life. And I just don't like the Greatest Generation. It just drives me insane. They are great people, but there are so many amazing humans during that first, 1910 through Korea, through Vietnam, that sacrificed everything and then came back and were just not right, and then didn't have accessibility to the help that they needed in order to regain a semblance of who they were beforehand. And you can see that. You can see how the culture changed, where, I mean, there's so much war for so long that suddenly men only wear three-piece business suits because that's their new uniform. And it just took over, the fashion world took over where the military world left off, so that they could have that conformed, nuclear structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I see that in family history, and I see how that affects and how it directly triggered the boomers to have like Woodstock and all that, because they wanted to have, there was a lot more freedom before the World War I. Just maybe we're in your little neighborhood of everybody who was Italian or, Jewish or German or whatever. But there was still more freedom to just embrace the culture that came with you. Whereas you get to the Cold War and you're in this post-war world and everything is America, America, America.
Evil commies. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, it's just interesting to take a seat back and look at. But, and I apologize if I'm rambling a lot. I think
no, please go on.
With history and through genealogy, it really does, history repeats itself. And I mean, like, you can do blatant, in 1920s, there was a railroad strike. In 2020s, there was a railroad strike. In 1918 to 20, there was a pandemic. In 2020, there was a pandemic. It repeats itself. So why aren't we changing things so this stops repeating itself? I mean, the information is right there, but people don't want information and facts.
Well, you bring up two good points, and this is also something I talk about on the show quite frequently. Everyone needs therapy. Everyone will benefit from therapy. Therapy is not a bad thing. I'm happy to see that society is finally starting to warm up to that idea. But what I feel like the biggest issue that we have is unredressed trauma from our lives.
Yeah.
And especially with that generation of folks, the generation that made the boomers, they were particularly tight-lipped, and they were not so into mental health, partly because that entire field hadn't really been fleshed out as much as it is now, or at all. But it's just one of those things where we can't stop it unless we know that it's happening. And there's part of me that feels like a lot of this history is deliberately inaccessible because for somebody or some group of people, us repeating the cycle is beneficial. It keeps the gravy train rolling the same, and nobody's asking questions. It might not be a perfect system, but it's a system that works. So
yes,
but that's why I see what you do and history as a whole as being so important, because it gives you context. It gives you grand context. We can only view our life from our own perspective. And even that, we only get 80 years, right? We have to look back. We have to listen to people that experienced stuff that was different. I'm interested in what your thoughts of what the future is going to be, because, we probably saw the internet come out. I don't know if you had video games as a kid. Yeah. So
all of them.
Okay. So we've seen the transition. We're the last generation that knew what life was like before. There's whole generations of people now who have never experienced life without staring at a screen or completely being dependent on the internet. I'm interested in what your thoughts for the future of what comes based on your understanding of the history and watching it kind of, again, cyclically unfold before us in a different way.
I think that life doesn't move nearly as quickly as everybody thinks that it does. And I think a lot of things that people nowadays are like, this is new because of this is new because of that, isn't new. I think unless we... Gosh, that's a hard question. I think that we need to talk more. And we need to have better communication on this level, on the street level between people, and understand that the barriers that are being presented to us may not actually be there. I often tell my child, it's all made up. It's all made up. Everything that's around us is just those people that are telling us how to act, and that you shouldn't need someone to tell you to be nice to people. You should just know, because it actually does directly affect you if you're addicted. It's easy to be mean. It's easy to be bad. So with the future, I don't know. I see a lot of people who are bringing about change. I do see a lot of people who are working hard to make other people aware that, so it's more transparent, so that we can say, oh, wait, we do have things in common. And move forward. I'm not sure. I don't know. Right now, if you would ask me a month ago, I'm sure I would have had a much more
reasonable interpretation.
But right now, I think that this too shall pass, because it does. I mean, we watched it again. It all passes. This won't be forever. I just hope it doesn't hurt as much as I think it may. I would like to think that we're going to be able to start putting limitations on what is accessible on the internet in order to help people better understand. I would like our education system to be better so that people have access to it, but I don't know. I think that I really don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I'm in a very pessimistic.
None of us do. We're treading into uncharted territory, and I don't think people used to give me. They used to be annoyed with my perspective on things, and I'd have to explain to them, I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm actually a very hopeful person. There's things that I want to achieve in a utopian world, right? But I'm also a realist and understand that this isn't we don't live in a utopian world. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's any problem with a healthy dose of skepticism, because again, we're going into uncharted territory. And you said something before about like people just don't want to know a fact. Like they don't want to know truth. They just want to hear what agrees with their feeling. And I couldn't agree with that more. I've gone out of my way my whole life to always confront the uncomfortable truths, because the uncomfortable truths to me are in some way more satisfying than a lie that makes me happy for a short period of time, But I don't know. We right now we're in like this, even in terms of that, like we can't even verify the information that we get.
Yes.
Is as solid as it should be, for us to be able to make an informed decision. So I can only imagine for people who don't remember life before the spectacle, that they'll only be able to look at things based on like how they're being told to look at it. And I don't know. Does that make sense? Like I remember back when I was a kid, I had to think for myself sometimes.
Yes.
I was forced to think for myself. I couldn't look up something on the internet. I couldn't use a calculator. I had to think for myself.
Yes.
And, how much can you think for yourself if you're constantly looking at a screen that's ultimately just trying to sell you something?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think if everything stays cyclical, what comes next is all of this ends, because it's just going to end. It is. I feel that people are going to get to a point where the fear it's more important to push past the stuff that's scaring them and keeping them at home. Because they understand if they don't push past the fear and they don't make the steps, I mean, everybody keeps waiting for somebody to do it. You're somebody. Do it. and everybody, you can't. I think at some point people are going to move forward. We're going to start seeing picketing, sit-ins, the grassroots of everybody coming together, uniting to make change. Because that's when big changes happen in this country. It's usually a grassroots movement where a bunch of people get together and go, I am really sick of this, and I'm not doing
this anymore.
We can't do it anymore. And I mean, I'm sure everybody's brain automatically goes to the 60s, and then you see the picketers with Nixon. But I'm talking about, at one point, there were people who, the big coal people, they owned entire lands, and then they would have areas called patches, and that's where their employees lived. They lived on the patches, which they rented from the guy who owned the place.
They pay him scrip, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So you got paid to work in the mines, then you paid them to live by the mines so that you could work in the mines. And then one day everyone was like, this is bullshit. And then there were huge uprisings in the steel industry, in the coal industry, all of this, in the train industry. I mean, the 1920s train, that was amazing. I read an article once, and do you know where Needles, California is? Okay, it's south of Los Angeles. It's hot. It's desert. Okay, there's not a lot there. If you drive through there now, get gas before you go in because there's not a lot there.
It's like desert.
It's desert. Conductors got off the trains in the middle of the desert in Needles and left. People, produce, whatever. People will get sick of it.
Yeah.
In the 80s, there was a lot of turmoil, and there were a lot of, the mills were starting to close down, and people were out striking, and that's where the change comes in. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that, and it's not just going to be the minorities that are out there like the last time. I think it's going to be a lot of people out there this time, and that's where the change is going to come from. Because once everything settles and we realize that this isn't going to change anything for the better. Trickle down doesn't work. It never has, and it never will. But once this newer generation embraces that, I think we're going to start seeing more people going out, not going to work, starting strikes,
The younger generation, for sure, they are there. They are at the point where they're like, I'm not going to stay in a job till I die.
Right.
I want to do something that I want to do. I'd rather be poor than be your slave.
Exactly.
Really, that's, and I also agree with you that ultimately the hardships are going to get so great that they're going to know no boundary. Everyone that is like a part of the general population like us will start to feel it at a way that will be unignorable. Mm-hmm. And as soon as people realize, oh, we're all suffering, I say this too a lot, like America makes big changes when people have to collectively suffer.
Yes.
When there's like a problem that is so great that people put their differences aside even for a short moment, then change happens. So
yes.
We'll get close, and the economy is probably going to be the reason for it. But I have always felt this way. But you start talking to people on an individual level, and you find you have more in common with people. And you start looking at your family tree, and you start finding out that maybe there's a little more diversity to my own background that I had no idea.
Like generational trauma is another thing that comes up a lot, and I think it goes hand in hand with this. And when you work on your family tree and you start noticing that people didn't deal with stuff, and that's what got handed down. So Then you get this big plate of junk that wasn't yours because the older generations didn't talk about it. And it was, somebody finally has to say stop. And I think with a lot of people working on their family history and their family tree, they're the ones saying, well, we're not going to do this anymore. There's a better way. I can learn about my family history. I can see that we came from, Italy, and I can understand that the sacrifices that they made, but I don't owe them. I owe myself so that I can push forward and bring new stuff to the next generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we the people need to recognize that and understand that there is knowledge and power in understanding history and understanding your history and why your family did the things that they did, and that it's not weird that somebody else did something different. I think that's another big conversation I have with clients.
That's awesome that somebody did. That's the whole point. It's like,
yes.
Oh wow, my family did it this way, and your family did it that way. Wow,
yes.
That's incredible. Look at how much more we know about our world now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's scary stuff. Especially start digging into the past, especially if there's skeletons there. I get it, but there's like. I didn't understand generational trauma for the longest time. I was like, what? Is it like in your genetics? Like you're just programmed to be an asshole? What's the deal with that? And then just thinking about it like, no. Somebody at some point in the chain was a certain way. Because of their traumas, they didn't deal with it. And they put all that emotional baggage on the people around them. And the people around them, because they didn't want to get destroyed by this incredibly toxic individual, they pass it around to everyone else around them. Yes. And, like you're saying, it makes a lot to me. I don't think we really have a crime issue in America, at least. I think we have a mental health issue.
Yes.
And I think most of the problems that we would just throw somebody in jail for, they probably just need some medical grade therapy. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I say it all the time on the show, but therapy for all. Any person, if you think you're above therapy, you're not. Your therapist isn't above therapy. So just go to therapy. True. It's never a bad thing to talk to somebody, and it's almost always better than emotionally exploding. Exactly.
It's never a bad thing to talk to somebody. It's never a bad thing if you need medication because it's never that doesn't mean you're weak. And it doesn't mean you're not manly or womanly or whateverly enough. It's something, and you can see those patterns that get handed down. And like that story I told about the guy who got on the boat and went all the way back to England, and then he died there. Was it worth it?
Yeah.
I mean, he had a great family. They lived in a nice house, and they loved each other, but he wanted to get compensated for something. I'm like, sometimes you need to take a step back and look around and be like, is it worth it? Is it worth saying, I'm not going to go to therapy? Is it worth not looking into your family history because you may learn a secret? You're going to learn a secret. If you work on your family history, you're going to learn secrets. Because everybody had them,
Well, this has been amazing. I want to thank you so much for coming on here and having this conversation with me. I certainly want to get you back on for a more like targeted conversation, but we'll talk after we stop the recording. But just so everyone who's listening and watching can be aware, I just want to show you the socials. Here's the TikTok. I'll have the links to all these in the description, your Instagram, and of course Linktree, and then your website. So all these links will be in the description for you to check out what Aryn does and support. And any final words for everyone who's listening?
Don't be afraid to learn about your family history because it can be life-changing and help you understand yourself better.
Love that. All right, this has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. We're out of here. Thank you so much, folks.
This has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. The end. With your host, James Oliva. Executive producers, Clint G and James Oliva.
That's obnoxious.
Sound design, mix, and master by James Oliva.
Literally no one cares.
For more Totally Legitimate Business, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Totally Legitimate Business or add us on TikTok at TLB Pod.
When will this end?
Thank you for listening. Now get back to work.
Move it along, buddy.